Welcome back to our unexpected art interview with David Garneau. This is part 2. You had mentioned that you've been focusing on through your art exploring what it means to be Métis.
Yep.
What does it mean to you?
So first of all, it begins for me in family and kinship. So knowing my relations, I have a different relationships. For instance, with one of my brothers, Mike, I brought him out to Batoche. So Batoche is a historical site, but a site of a 1885 resistance battle between Métis and the government for basically a nation. And it didn't work out. People were distributed and dispersed, and there was a time of repression. But in 1982, Métis were recognized in the Canadian Constitution, and then some kinds of reconciliation were happening over time and to this day. My dad was an amateur historian and collected a lot of stories. And one of my brothers, Mike, who lives in Calgary, was very, very interested in this. So he got his citizenship as well. And I think it was summer before last, we went up to Batoche together, and I'd been on the shared management board there, so had pretty good knowledge of the place. But it reinforcing kinship, I've got 2 kids, bringing them to these Métis events. So a lot of it has to do with just engaging the culture in that. But understanding our relation to other Indigenous people, so First Nations and Inuit people in Canada, but also Indigenous folks in the States. And as I mentioned, Australia. I'll be going to New Zealand in a little bit in November. And I've been there a couple times before, so the Maori there. And I've also been to the Sami territory in northern Norway and Finland and Sweden. And so looking at those alliances in theory and in writing, as well as in art, writing about museum practices with having to do with Indigenous belongings. It extends, so starting with the family and the land that we're living on and moving up to these other possibilities, it's sort of the spiral of interests. So that's what it means to me. But there are a lot of particular things, in terms of engaging in spirituality. Just this morning, as I say, the indigenization of this campus is incredible. Our chancellor is Cadmus Delorme, who's a First Nations guy, and we just had a pipe ceremony on the lawn this morning, and you don't get that a lot of other universities or colleges. So that's pretty meaningful. So I don't engage just in Métis stuff, but also First Nations learning as well.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, very lucky here.
Have there been any surprise discoveries you've made as you've explored either in your art practice or just learning about the history and the connection? Any unexpected things you've discovered either about yourself or your community?
Well, it's constant amazement. Maybe 18 years ago, it was the first time I went to Australia. So I've been part of 4 Indigenous curator delegations from Canada, and 2 of them went to Australia and New Zealand once, and a couple to Venice for the Biennales. I hadn't traveled beyond the plains much, so those were huge eye-openers, but to understand how colonialism impacted folks, particularly in Australia, identically. They had Indian residential schools and basically pass systems, reserve systems, and children taken from Indigenous homes and raised by white families in the 60s and 70s. Like, that was extraordinary. So, you think something is just your region, then you go to larger parts of Canada and realize, oh no, it's the same there pretty much. But then to a whole other country on the other side of the globe, those were shocking things. The similarities among Indigenous experience, not only their relations to the lands and each other, but also even more in common because of common colonization. That's a shock.
Yeah, so I've heard and seen some depictions of what that was like, and it's not something I've ever experienced or probably will ever experience as a very, very white American.
Yeah.
But it's just horrifying to see what people can sometimes do to people who look different, how they sometimes try and destroy that difference. But that difference, that culture, that heritage is still there. And it's starting to grow again.
Yeah, it's amazing how the cultures and actual bodies have survived. It's really amazing to me. So that's a constant surprise.
it's a much happier surprise.
Yeah, well, I don't know if happy has everything to do with it, but it's a good surprise.
More pleasant then.
Yeah, it's just a lot of it is struggle. Like when young people realize the extent, I'll have students who are aware of their living situation and how they contrast with others. And then they realize how it's a function of colonization, a function of how settlers people have come to the country and cheated folks out of their land, and people were kept on reserve so they couldn't own property, couldn't vote until what was it, 62? They had to get a pass to leave, so they couldn't build up equity. They couldn't own things. I mean, there's just so much that happened. And then people realized that's a legacy of their families. I've had students who themselves went to Indian residential schools, and certainly their parents did. And it's still affecting them psychologically, but also materially. The depth and breadth of the harms are extraordinary, because I'm moving into my later years and I've seen so much change, but also so much that's remained virtually the same and will take many, many generations to overcome.
Took generations to build those institutions. It'll take just as long, if not longer, to take it down and start healing from that.
Yeah. And the transformation begins with those folks being teachers, teaching in the institutions and listening to students, but also letting them know what's going on or happened. I mean, I live in a city where the major art institution is directed by an indigenous guy, whose family's actually from the States there, John Hampton. And that's extraordinary. There aren't enough indigenous professors here at the University of Regina, but the student population is, I think it's 13 or 15% are indigenous. So it has a real impact. So I've actually lived enough to see these changes. So hopefully it'll continue.
Hopefully. Who are some other people that you have seen using art in whatever form to push back and make more of a place for different indigenous or other minority cultures?
The list is very long. I mean, Kent McMahon is pretty well known in the States as well as Canada. And I think he's maybe a year younger than me, but he's a really fine painter. He does these giant history paintings, but he inserts, they look like 19th century landscape paintings and history paintings, but they insert indigenous people in them, especially queer indigenous people. And they're hilarious. They're amazing. They have a huge impact. I love his films too, his performances. So he's great. There are other incredible artists, say out of Quebec, like Nadia Muir and Hannah Claus, and it's just countless. They're all people I admire, look up to, and am friends with and work with in various capacities. But yeah, Indigenous creative production is legendary right now and recognized throughout Canada and increasingly around the world.
I'm very, very happy to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious to see what that's going to look like going forward. Do you have any thoughts or dreams of things you'd like to see happen?
I'm interested in the Indigenous art world. So these are not just Indigenous artists, but also Indigenous curators and writers. And increasingly, they are creating exhibitions. They're great curators, actually living in the States now. A former student of mine, Candace Hopkins, works out of New York State, but was in Santa Fe before this. They are curating exhibitions. So Indigenous people curating Indigenous exhibitions of Indigenous art, and hopefully reviewed by Indigenous people and circulating among Indigenous folks. But then also the larger art world, of course, are invited. But these have been very transformative. I'm also interested long term. I mentioned that I write for a Southeast Asian, primarily run magazine out of, it's online, but out of Vancouver. These collaborations between Indigenous and so-called of a color folks, and especially with African Canadians, African Americans, is really, really important. And so that's increasing in Canada, cautiously, carefully. But those alliances are very, very important.
Watching people find common ground, because yes, the differences are there, but they're not as great as some people make them out to be, I don't think. We have more in common.
Yeah, there's a common oppression. There are some big differences, like the relationship with indigenous folks and land and being invaded
Yes.
is quite different. But how do you deal with enslaved folks or descendants of enslaved folks? Are they considered settlers in the same way European colonizers? Well, no. So then what's our relation? And I'm interested in all that complexity and how we build futures. So imagining the futures that we want to live towards is a main motivator of my practices.
As for your students, what do you hope they take away from your teaching, both in the social aspect as well as just as artists and in their practice?
Well, you said it really profoundly early on. You never know what they're going to take. And often it can just be a sentence. I remember it was a colleague of mine 20 some years ago, Indigenous colleague, had said something about, I mentioned, I did studio art without Indigenous themes to start off with, and then I did American literature. I was writing about Henry James, of all people, none of them related to Indigenous stuff. And I was working into the Indigenous through my own family history and just sort of muddling my way towards something. And this colleague of mine, said something about, well, you're an expert in Indigenous art. And I said, no, I'm not, but I could be, even though I've never taken any courses in this, or it's not been my focus. But by really, through concentrated effort, given the position I'm in here, that I have room to study and research. But it was just that one sentence that made me think, yeah, and that's something I'd like to do. Move me in an entirely different direction. So you never know the impact you're going to have. But knowing that you're just one among many influences of folks who are building their practice and trying to keep honesty, integrity, showing them what you think is real, but also enough of a humility to know that, yeah, you're just one voice among many. You're just doing your best.
Is there any advice you wish someone had shared with you when you first started your journey as an artist?
I got a couple of bits of advice from books, actually. So I still like Carl Jung. A bunch of my friends were really interested in spirituality and mysticism and that. But I read a line he wrote about taking care of business. Basically, the first half of life, you got to find yourself a way in the world before you start speculating and spiritualizing. And so, while I'm a very intuitive person and like the possibilities, things, knuckling down and taking care of business is really important. I teach a grad course right now, and that's among the main themes. Learn how to write, learn how to take photographs of your work, document, all the professional stuff. I had a colleague at another institution I taught at, and met with him, oh my God, like 25 years ago. He was one of these big abstract American painters, and we taught together, and we were quite opposites, but got along well in our differences. And at one point he said that take care of business. He was near retirement age at that point, but he regretted he didn't take care of certain things, I think he had imagined himself to be a prima donna in terms of working with a dealer. So trying to be a decent human being and taking care of the nuts and bolts, not expecting everybody else to do it for you, but it's nice when they do. That would be a good bit of advice.
You got to take yourself seriously, and you got to take your work seriously if it's going to get anywhere.
In the end, it's a serious business, and knowing whether you're a commercial artist, whether you're an academic artist or a thinker or a feeler, or all those things, and finding your community that can support but also critique and challenge you is among the most important things. But also on that practical side, I'd come across a book while I was still in my undergrad on sociology of art, and this author, I still got it somewhere, I haven't read it in years, but anyways, what this woman, sociologist, was showing how academics work and how you could go across North America, and if a prof was hired in 1969 to 73, chances they were a photorealist. Another period, and they're likely to be a minimalist. Another period, they're going to be a pop artist or abstract expressionist artist. Another period, it's the era of feminism or queer studies or whatever. And I was surprised by that. But then I would just look at my own campus and see, oh, there's our photorealist. There's our, well, we didn't have a feminist. It was terrible. I had to go to another school for that. We didn't have anybody of color or no indigenous. They were behind the times where I went to school. But really, you could see those sort of layers, and you can see how the world needs these outsiders because they're going to be the future builders. And so what I built my career on is always trying to anticipate the needs that will be in the future, so the indigenous, understanding that this sort of identity thing was still going to be important for a while and figuring a way around or with that. Recognize that I could take space in the academy because I would be needed in the future was a big boost. And so finding ways to be useful in the world is, again, part of this taking care of business.
Speaking of layering, backtracking a little bit to another one of the questions that I sent you, I told you we probably would only get to a couple of them before getting very distracted, but some of your paintings incorporate text and found imagery alongside the traditional painting elements. How do you go about building those layered compositions?
I haven't painted that way for quite a long time. So in the 90s, I followed the kind of appropriation to school, and I was interested in the high and the low. So European paintings paired with the comics. And at that time, I was interested in themes of masculinity, especially. That's what I was studying in my master's. And then when I shifted over to bringing in the indigenous, it was still around issues of masculinity and, high history paintings and vernacular comics or everyday photographs. So I was interested again in showing the complexity of indigeneity or indigenous settler traditions. So collage is still like a great way, these juxtapositions. I don't do it as much in that kind of literal collage way, but still in these still lives, bringing things together you wouldn't think should go together and to create new meanings is a great excitement to me, because those objects still retain their original narrative and belonging possibilities, semiotic possibilities. But when you bring them together, your brain tries to turn them into a sentence or to a story. And when you've got a literal title that pushes that further, it is just thrilling to me.
Yeah, you never know what story the viewer, your audience is going to tell from it, but they'll get what they need.
Yeah. But I also found in Nelson, so when Dark Chapters was first shown earlier this year, we had a group of Métis folks there, they're 16 or 20, and sat in a circle, and I asked them to pick paintings. And when they were telling the stories, because there were things from the culture in there, they were able to tell stories and get what I was saying. They had their personal stories to attach to it and their affective response, of course. But I was amazed at how this kind of cobbled together vocabulary, especially as you move from painting to painting, the sort of massive common narratives came up.
Now I'm wondering how those differ versus people who don't have that connection, but what stories they tell.
Yeah, so that's the great thing about that book, right? Is it's not all indigenous folks writing. I think there are 3 or 4 African Canadians or Black Canadians and Asian. There's just a range. There's just friends of mine. They take it in ways I would never expect. So there are common references. So for instance, to other artists, I often cite other artists and they'll make that connection. But how they relate to those other artists will be different. Or, yeah, they'll see things in there that I never would have thought of. They still show how the different semiotic bits tie together that make their story just as legitimate as mine. So I find that really amazing. But often they're launching pads to start a conversation about their experiences. They're certainly not wrong.
We've got more connecting us than we realize, even if we come from wildly different places.
Absolutely.
What are some other things that you don't get to talk about as much that you maybe wish you could talk more about?
Well, I'm in the talking profession, so I'm very,
Fair.
I'm very lucky. I have no problem with an outlet for things I'm working on or speculating about, whether I get to realize it in painting or teaching, working with students or writing especially. So I'm one of those rare individuals who feels heard most of the time. So the expression side isn't an issue, but if there's some question you have that is of interest to you, I'd be happy to entertain it, see if I can come up with something.
One question that I sometimes like to ask when talking to creatives, just because it's a fun conversation starter. Do you have a favorite dumb question people ask you when they hear that you're not a professor? Or when you talk about what kind of art you do, like whether dumb or silly, whether it leads to good conversation or.
I don't have a lot of tolerance these days for folks who don't do research. Like I do give quite a few interviews, and I appreciate when people either read some of my writing or I have an old website, so that's of no help. You have to go to Facebook or something. I appreciate that if people have some kind of understanding. That helps. At this point, if the person is open enough, then I can talk about the stuff that I want to talk that particular day. I don't think I've had anything really dumb happen. So, for instance, when you're asking about Métis, I was a facilitator at the Banff Center, which is this incredible artist residency program, big program in Alberta in the mountains. And it was a Métis gathering, the first one of its kind, and there were 18 artists there. We're always asking ourselves, who are Métis? What does it mean? So that one might be frustrating to some because there's sort of like a everyday answer everybody should know in Canada, but there's so many nuances. So that's not boring. My favorite question of all is, what is art? It takes me about an hour and a half to explain it, but I don't know anybody else who can answer that question. I love that one.
It's such a broad, complicated question, and you could ask 10 different people and get 10 wildly different answers.
I
And
know,
each of those answers would probably take at least 2 hours.
Yeah, but they don't know the right answers. They'll give you a teaser. So there's a philosopher, Arthur Danto, who tried to answer this question, and I had the honor of meeting him, an American. He died, it's been a while now. But he starts off and says, well, artworks all have titles. And so if you make something and you don't title it, you don't think it's worthy of being an artwork, and you're not even putting it in the playing field. Someone else might come around and say that it's an artwork, and they'll give it a title. And if they don't have a title ready to hand, they'll call it untitled. But that's a starting place, and it's profound. It's profound.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of people who are crafters, and they want to be taken seriously as artists, and they aren't because they're making gorgeous things, but they're not titled, and so they're not entitled to that privilege of being called an artwork. So there are actual rules, and I'm interested in the structures that underlie all our practices. That's just a starting point. There's other rules from Danto and others. But when you actually break it down, it's not as subjective as it appears. And so I'm interested in how all these structures work. I'm also interested in the homologies, how they are similar. You're interested in literature. Literature, from my experience doing that as a earlier scholarship, runs the same way as the art world. Not everything that's written counts as a novel or whatever, but all those things are broken down to categories, and they all have their rules, and they all have their societies and sociologies, and it's the same in the art world.
That's very, very true. I now kind of want to have you back on just to have the conversation of what is art.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm already just fascinated in that if you want to come back another day.
Sounds good. Well, thanks very much for the conversation.
Of course. Thanks for joining. If you would like to remind our listeners where they can find your work, if there's any particular events going on or galleries that you would like to shout out for people to keep an eye out for.
Dark Chapters, the book, is available at the University of Regina Press, but also in regular bookstores and online. I highly recommend it, not just because it's covering my work, but the writing is extraordinary. Very creative writing from the poetry and the differently analytic texts essays give you a lot of background in indigeneity, allyship, and still life traditions. I keep picking it up to learn from it. Honestly, it's a really great book. And the exhibition will be traveling. It'll be up in the Yukon at Whitehorse Art Gallery coming up. I think it opens in November and runs until March, and then it'll be at the Founders Gallery in Calgary, and then it comes to the Dunlop. So look out for that. Yeah, then you can see my monthly or my weekly paintings every Monday on my Facebook page. It's David Garneau. Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. Thanks for the opportunity.
Of course. I look forward to talking with you again.
You've been listening to an unexpected art interview with David Garneau. If you like what we're doing, you can follow us on social media and join the conversation over at An Unexpected Art Lesson on Threads, Blue Sky, and Substack. And you can also support us over on Patreon. Get early access to episodes and other fun things at patreon.com/anunexpectedartlesson.